Thomas Watson.
Hey fellow media students, my name is Thomas, and the question that I will be focusing this presentation on today will be, how does the video game section of the media communicate ideas to audiences? This is a question that has been commonly asked among the world of the media, and it typically falls under several smaller inquiries. The first of these is, why do games communicate messages? And the follow-up to it, can anyone use games to communicate messages, or is it only a select few? The answers are, the video game industry at base only really exists to provide entertainment to the audiences that they produce to. In order to make the experience more enjoyable and memorable, however, the makers may decide to communicate certain messages to the players through the game itself. This can be done by almost anyone who is willing to put the time and effort into the game that they are making, and they often make references to other, more popular video games to make the message more impactful or potent. Gamers will be used to a certain element in the game after playing many other of the same genre. But when that element is altered to send a message, the gamers will notice the change more, and the message will be received more easily. Next questions that need to be addressed are, do different player-based games communicate in different ways? As well as, do different genres of games communicate in different ways themselves? When playing a multiplayer game, people tend to get caught up in what the other players are thinking and doing instead of the game itself. On the other hand, when playing a single-player game, people tend to absorb more of the ideals the characters that represent them in the game are focused on. For example, if it is an RPG-styled game, then the player will have to pay more attention to themselves as a person in order to make certain decisions that reflect their own personalities. And in modern games, this can directly affect the outcome of the game. The best examples of games that do this are in Mass Effect 3, where you sometimes, where occasions come up where you need to make decisions between good and bad, known as Paragon and Renegade. And depending on the choices that you make in these key moments, it can affect the end game based on the decisions that your character has made. But it's not the character that's making the decisions, it's you. And that seems to sink in better with gamers. And it'll send messages to the gamers about the decisions that they've made based on their own opinions. This brings us to the next field of inquiry. Do video games communicate any skills to the audiences that play them? Though not necessarily all, most games today can communicate certain skills to the user depending on the game that they are playing. Almost all modern games fall into two major categories, single-player and multiplayer. According to the OECD, playing single-player games boosts your math, reading, science, and problem-solving abilities because you don't need to focus on anything else except for yourself and the game, exercising those abilities in turn. On the other hand, the skills that the multiplayer gamers obtain from their games are only really social, even if it may seem that they're doing more. On a bit of a side note, and this isn't as relevant, but I found it very interesting. Because boys tend to play more online games such as Call of Duty and Halo and, well, even Grand Theft Auto, which is online now, they don't receive the skill boosts brought by the single-player games, whereas it seems that the vast majority of girls who play games at all tend to gravitate more towards single-player games, so that they do get this boost. That's just really something I found very interesting, that the differences between the genders and the skills that they earn because of the type of games that they tend to play. A very common question that is frequently asked by many people today is, can video games affect your behavior? If so, are these behavior changes permanent? Games immerse you in a world where certain rules may apply that differ from our own. With some games, such as Grand Theft Auto, these rules change that of those in the real world, and they encourage things like violence. Unfortunately, young teens and even children are the ones who are playing these games the most often, even though they're targeted at adults. And yet, they are the most susceptible to the influence, as their brains have not yet fully developed. After spending enough time in fictional worlds like this, your own perception of the real world may change slightly. However, these influences on your behavior tend to dissipate reasonably soon after you stop playing the game, no matter what stage of your life you're at. Usually, parents and guardians of children are worried by the possibility that their angels can be corrupted by the evil bloop-de-bloops, and on more than one occasion have tried to get certain games removed from the market entirely. This leads me to a reasonably important question. Can games be prevented from reaching audiences because of certain messages that they send? The answer, no. As stated by the Globe and Mail, the Supreme Court has ruled that the government cannot restrict the sale of violent video games because the medium falls under the protection of the First Amendment, which, among other things, restricts the creation of laws that impede free speech. Beyond its legal ramifications, the ruling does something else. It states clearly that video games are as capable of communicating ideas as with any other artistic medium. Games may contain violence, sexuality, and other forms of mature content, but potential exits for significant meaning to be found in any or all of it, and that's not something the government can or should attempt to regulate. The best modern example of this is a game that is currently being created known as Hatred. Hatred is the first game in years to receive an A rating on the ESRB. The reason for this is because the premise involves you, the protagonist, going around harming civilians. Not harming, I mean killing, murdering. You're a mass murderer. Now, that may not sound like fun. That may sound absolutely shocking, which is totally understandable. However, this game still has the right to be made and sold, just not to minors or young adults. Only adults, mature and grown-up adults, can buy this game. Now, parents are worried that their children will get a hold of this game and play it. That's the parents' problem. That's why this game will be allowed to be released. The reason it was made is because, as stated by the creators, they wanted to break free of the current norm of game developers, where games have become too nice, too clean, and they wanted to take a step back from that and go and do something very shocking, because it provides the shock value alone provides so much publicity that essentially sells itself just because of how shocked the fans are that this game even exists. However, that does not deny the game the right to be made. That would be a violation of human rights. That would be a denial of freedom of speech. However, parents and authority figures who are worried about their children's exposure from video games should dissuade some audiences from playing games that are inappropriate for them. It's not the children's fault that they are being influenced by this. It's the parents who allow them to play it. There are 3 final questions that need to be answered in order to seal the deal on our original subject. Luckily, researcher Jack Lule has done an incredible job in finding the solutions. The questions are: how can video games affect many people at once to affect each other in turn? Can video games communicate complex messages? If so, how? And do video games use any other platform other than the ones made specifically for games to communicate messages? Well, he responds, team-oriented video games have allowed new groups to learn skills similar to those learned in physical sports. Team building, competition, and problem solving are all major components of playing on a virtual team. He also states, virtual worlds, though not video games in themselves, use the design and principles of video games to create new social spaces. These spaces are being used to create new social platforms and new ways of communicating complex ideas. So yes, they do indeed communicate complex ideas. Finally, video games have been added to social networking sites to expand the ways in which people can communicate with each other. The medium of the game allows players to interact with their friends in new ways that have never been experienced before up until their creation. At long last, we can come to our final verdict. Video games communicate ideas to their audiences by getting inside of their heads. This can be done in 2 ways. One is by making the player consciously think about what is happening in their game, either through a message that was intentionally sent by the makers, or about the behavior of one of the characters. The other way is to subconsciously alter the way players perceive their lives and surroundings, sometimes in a good way and sometimes in a bad way. This may not be done intentionally, but it usually happens to anyone after being exposed to a game for a certain period of time. The player also subconsciously changes in terms of the way they solve problems or execute tasks in the real world. The player being exposed to the game alone causes all of this. So our final verdict is, yes, video games do communicate messages, and in a variety of different ways. Thank you for listening, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.